my son. You are responsible for his death. Why did you do this to me? You are responsible for my husband's death. You killed him. No, I didn't. I swear I didn't do it.
She humiliated her daughter-in-law at the funeral of her husband. What happened next will shock you. She stood at the altar, dressed in black, soaked in tears, playing the role of a grieving mother. But the funeral wasn't enough for her. She needed an audience. In front of mourners, family, and strangers, she turned to her daughter-in-law, the young widow still shaking from loss, and humiliated her without mercy. Accusations whispered loud enough to cut.
Insults wrapped in tradition.
Cruel words meant to bury more than just a body. The widow wasn't supposed to speak. She wasn't supposed to fight back. She was supposed to bow and disappear. But someone at that funeral was watching closely. Someone who knew the truth behind the tears. Someone who had waited for the right moment. And when the truth finally surfaced, the silence broke, the crowd froze, and the woman who came to shame a widow left carrying her own disgrace. Because that day, the funeral didn't just end a life. It exposed a lie that would change everything forever. Welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly watch, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We'll be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Before we move to the main story, if today is your first time of watching our video, please subscribe. Rain tried to fall over Lagos that morning, but the clouds couldn't commit. Just a hot, stubborn drizzle that made black clothes cling to skin and grief smell like sweat and dust. Inside the grand church on the island, the air conditioning fought the crowd and still lost. Cameras flashed softly. Perfumes mixed with damp fabric. At the front, a polished casket sat like a cruel centerpiece under white flowers, and the name on the banner looked unreal in gold letters. Chigbe Ikemba. People whispered it the way Nigerians whisper money, half admiration, half fear. 33 years old. Born in a quieter corner of the city to an ordinary father who never owned more than a small toolbox, yet somehow Ikemba had grown into a billionaire who moved deals like chess pieces, oil logistics, real estate flips, fast money that came with fast enemies. He loved his wife, Uzo Amako Nchigbe, the way rich men rarely love, openly, protectively, like she was the one thing he never wanted to bargain with. But now his picture stood beside the casket, smiling in a suit, and the church felt like it was holding its breath. The only person not trembling was the mother of the dead man, already standing like she came to win something. And when she stepped toward the altar, the crowd shifted like they sensed blood, wondering who she planned to bury next. A slow hymn dragged through the speakers, but it couldn't cover the sharp sound of heels moving with purpose across marble tiles. Nchigbe Afok. The mother walked like the funeral belonged to her alone, like she had paid for every tear in the room. Her head tie was tied too perfectly for a woman broken, her eyes too dry, her face too controlled. People knew her story, an ordinary basket weaver from years ago, hands once rough from palm fronds and market sun, now polished by proximity to her billionaire son's world. And that shift had done something dangerous to her spirit. Like poverty had been a chain she escaped and swore never to respect again. She reached the pulpit and laid her palms on it as if claiming property. The pastor tried to speak, tried to keep the service holy, but Afok's gaze swept the pews and landed on one spot, front row, near the aisle, where a young widow sat in black lace, shoulders tight, eyes swollen, fingers twisting tissue into pieces. Uzo Amako looked like someone whose heart had been ripped out and then asked to smile through it. Afok's lips curved, not a smile, more like a blade being unsheathed. In that moment, the room didn't feel like a church anymore. It felt like a courtroom, and the judge had finally arrived. A hush spread as Afok lifted a hand, and even the crying quieted like the crowd had been trained to fear her. She began softly, almost sweet, thanking people for coming, describing her son as a good man, a generous man, a man too kind for this wicked world. Each compliment landed like bait, and the congregation nodded along. lulled into agreement. Then her tone changed, not loud, not dramatic, just colder, sharper, like a fan suddenly switched off in a heat wave. She turned her full body toward Uzoamako, and it was as if the widow became a spotlighted object. Afok spoke about wives who forget respect, women who enjoy soft life but refuse obedience, and girls who enter a family and bring misfortune. Every sentence sounded like wisdom until you noticed the direction of her eyes. People began to shift in their seats, glancing from the widow to the casket to each other, hungry for scandal because grief alone is never enough entertainment in Lagos. Uzoamako's throat tightened. Her hands trembled in her lap. She didn't cry loudly. She tried to swallow everything, because tradition had taught her that widows must be quiet, must not talk back, must not draw attention, must accept whatever a husband's people throw at her. But Afok wasn't throwing words. She was throwing a rope, and she was waiting to see if the widow would hang herself with it. A sharp murmur rose when Afok leaned forward, voice now loud enough to bounce off the church walls. She accused without naming the accusation. Those dangerous Nigerian half-statements that plant poison without evidence. She talked about carelessness and bad luck that follows certain women. She mentioned how Ikemba had changed after marriage, how he became too soft, how he stopped listening to his mother, how he started making decisions that didn't include the family. Each line was designed to turn love into a crime. Then she dropped her first real stone. She said her son did not die naturally, that heaven itself knew something was wrong, that somebody had been smiling too much during his sickness. The room sucked in air. A few women covered their mouths. Men stared at the widow with that slow, suspicious look men use when they want to believe the worst about a woman. Uzoamako's face drained of color. Her breath became shallow. She looked around for a familiar hand, a friend, an ally, anything. But the pew beside her felt like empty space even though people sat there. Afok's words did what they were meant to do. They moved the crowd from mourning to judging. And right there, beside the casket of the man she loved, Uzoamako realized she wasn't attending a funeral. She was standing inside a trap, one that had been set long before today. A camera phone rose from the back like a curious snake, then another, then three more, because in Lagos grief can turn into content in seconds. Afok saw the phones and grew bolder, feeding off the attention like it was oxygen. She called Uzoamako ungrateful. She called her a visitor that overstayed. She implied she was after money. She used the oldest weapon in family wars, public shame, because it turns even innocent women into suspects. Uzoamako's eyes burned, but she refused to cry loudly, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She remembered the man in the casket. Ikemba's hands around her waist in the kitchen, his laughter bouncing off tiles, his voice promising that no matter what his family thought, she was safe with him. She remembered how he'd met her. Almost miraculous, like fate had chased him down. A billionaire stranded in a Lagos flood one evening, his convoy stuck, his security confused, and a young woman offering him a simple umbrella and calm directions like she didn't know his name. That quiet courage had pulled him in like a hook. He married her despite the noise, despite his mother's warnings, despite his world's hunger for a better woman. And now, that same mother stood at his funeral using his death as a stage to destroy the woman he chose. The humiliation wasn't just for Uzoamako. It was a final insult to Ikemba's love. And the crowd. Oh, the crowd was starting to enjoy it. A sharp slap of fabric sounded as Afok adjusted her shawl, preparing for her final blow, because she wasn't done until Uzoamako was reduced to nothing. She stepped down from the pulpit and walked toward the widow, slow and deliberate, forcing everyone to watch the way predators force prey to feel every second. Uzoamako tried to stand, but her legs felt heavy, like grief had turned to cement in her bones. Afok stopped in front of her, close enough that Uzoamako could smell bitter herbs and expensive perfume layered together, old village and new money in the same breath. Afok's voice dropped, but the microphone still carried it. She said the widow had no right to sit in the front, no right to wear lace, as if she was a proper wife, no right to look like she still belonged. She spoke of family meetings Uzoamako was never invited to, decisions she was not qualified to understand, and traditions she failed to honor. She reached toward the widow's wrist like she wanted to pull her up by force, and the movement sparked a wave of murmurs through the church. Even the pastor hesitated, unsure whether to intervene, because in African families, a mother's power can silence even men of God. Uzoamako's body stiffened. Her lips parted slightly, as if a word was finally trying to escape. But the widow knew one wrong sentence could turn the whole room against her, so she swallowed it again, and Afolk's eyes gleamed like she had just won. A sudden wail rose from somewhere near the back, either real sorrow or stage distraction, and in that split second, Afolk seized the moment to make her humiliation unforgettable. She raised her hand and announced that after the burial, the widow would return all property, all keys, all documents, and leave the family house immediately, because a woman like this could not be trusted to remain near Ikemba's legacy. The word legacy landed like a thunderclap. Heads snapped up. Some people leaned forward. Greed woke up in the room like a sleeping dog. Uzoamako's eyes widened, not because of the insult, but because she realized something deeper was happening. Afolk wasn't just grieving. She was positioning herself. This was a takeover disguised as mourning. And the scariest part? The crowd was already adjusting to the new story like it was truth, because Nigerians love a villain, and they love a widow even less. Uzoamako's fingers clenched around the tissue until it tore. Her chest tightened like a door being locked from the inside. She looked at the casket again, desperate, as if the dead man could sit up and stop this madness. But the casket stayed silent. The church stayed silent. And Afolk's voice filled the space like a verdict, until, somewhere in the middle rows, a figure stood up quietly, watching Afolk with a kind of calm that only comes when someone already knows the truth and is ready to release it. Heat pressed down on the church like a heavy hand as Uzoamako remained seated, her black veil damp against her cheeks, her breath shallow and uneven. The pew beneath her felt hard, unforgiving, as if even the wood had turned against her. Around her, bodies shifted, people whispering into palms, eyes sliding over her like she was a stain no one wanted to touch. She could hear the hum of the generator outside, the distant horns of Lagos traffic reminding her that life was moving on without her permission. Her husband's name still echoed in her ears, yet the space beside her felt wider than the Atlantic. In that moment, she understood a painful truth African widows learn too quickly. You can be surrounded by hundreds and still be completely alone. Her shoulders curled inward, not from weakness, but from instinct, like a wounded animal protecting its last soft part. She stared at the floor tiles, tracing cracks with her eyes, counting breaths, counting heartbeats, trying not to drown in the sound of judgment hanging above her. But the silence didn't protect her. It only made room for more cruelty, and she could feel it coming, slow and deliberate, like a storm that announces itself long before the rain. Fabric rustled again as mourners adjusted themselves, inching subtly away from her, creating invisible space as if widowhood was contagious. A woman she once laughed with at family dinners now avoided her eyes, suddenly fascinated by her phone screen. A man who had toasted her marriage months ago cleared his throat and leaned back, arms crossed, face tight with suspicion. Uzoamako felt herself shrinking, not because she believed the lies, but because the room was beginning to believe them for her. Her fingers trembled against her lap, nails pressing into her palm to keep herself grounded in her own body. Tradition whispered in her head like a cruel instructor, "Endure, be quiet, don't embarrass the family, don't raise your voice." She remembered her mother's words when she married into the Nshigbe family. A widow must learn patience faster than happiness. Back then, it sounded like advice. Now, it sounded like a warning she was living inside. She swallowed hard, tasting salt and dust, wondering how grief could be so loud and yet make her feel so invisible at the same time. A flicker of memory pulled her backward without mercy. She saw herself months earlier in the hospital corridor, white walls, sharp disinfectant smell, Ikemba lying still, machines humming like insects that refused to rest. She had prayed silently, bargaining with God in a voice she barely recognized, promising anything, everything, if he would just breathe normally again. She remembered sleeping upright in a chair, refusing to leave his side, wiping his lips with water, whispering jokes he couldn't laugh at anymore. No one saw those nights. No one applauded that devotion. Now, standing accused in public, she realized sacrifice is invisible until it's convenient to deny it. The crowd didn't see the woman who held her husband through pain. They only saw the widow they could blame. And that realization settled into her chest like a stone, heavy and cold, making every breath feel borrowed. A cough echoed from somewhere behind her, and Uzoamako flinched, as if it were directed at her. Every small sound felt amplified, every movement a potential threat. She adjusted her veil slightly, a simple gesture that somehow drew more eyes, more silent commentary. In African spaces, stillness itself can become suspicious. She felt judged for not crying enough, judged for crying too quietly, judged for simply existing in a body that survived when her husband did not. Her back straightened instinctively, pride warring with fear, because disappearing would mean surrendering the last piece of herself she still controlled. She remembered Ikemba's voice again, firm and warm, telling her she never had to beg for space in his life. The irony stung. He had protected her so fiercely in life, and yet in death, his absence left her exposed. The crowd leaned closer, waiting, watching, sensing weakness like sharks smell blood, and Uzoamako knew they were expecting her to crumble at any second. Sweat traced a slow line down her spine as Afoke's presence hovered nearby, heavy even when she wasn't speaking. The mother-in-law's shadow felt longer than her body, stretching over Uzoamako's thoughts, her posture, her breathing. Years of quiet tension flashed through her mind, forced smiles at family gatherings, backhanded compliments, warnings disguised as jokes. She had learned early that survival meant politeness, that peace meant swallowing small humiliations before they grew teeth. But today, those swallowed moments were rising, one by one, demanding recognition. Uzoamako's jaw tightened. Her grief began to change shape, hardening into something unfamiliar, something steadier. She didn't yet call it strength. She only knew it wasn't fear anymore. And that shift scared her more than Afoke's accusations ever could. A bead of sweat slid down her temple as she slowly lifted her eyes, just enough to take in the room without fully exposing herself. She noticed how the light from the stained glass windows fractured across the floor, broken colors scattered like pieces of a story no one had put together yet. She noticed how the casket sat silently, polished and closed, keeping its secrets. She noticed how the crowd leaned toward Afoke, hungry for direction, for someone to tell them what to believe. In that moment, Uzoamako understood something painfully clear. Silence wasn't neutral. It was being used against her. Every second she stayed quiet, another lie settled into place. Her chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't panic. It was pressure. Pressure building towards something inevitable. A soft inhale filled her lungs, deeper than the ones before, as if her body was preparing itself without her permission. Her fingers loosened, then clenched again, knuckles whitening beneath black lace.
She didn't speak.
Not yet. But something inside her shifted, like a door unlocking after years of rust. The widow everyone expected to vanish was still seated, still breathing, still present. And while the crowd assumed her silence meant defeat, they failed to notice the change in her eyes. The way they no longer darted, the way they steadied, focused, waiting. Whatever came next would not be accidental. Whatever came next would cost someone something. And as the church settled into a tense, expectant quiet, one truth hovered unspoken in the air. Uzoamako was done disappearing, but no one was ready for what that would mean. A sharp scrape echoed across the church floor as a wooden stool was dragged forward, slow and deliberate, its sound slicing through the fragile quiet like a warning bell. Afok claimed the space beside the altar as if it had been waiting for her all along. She didn't rush. She never rushed when power was involved. Her wrapper brushed the floor, heavy with authority borrowed from age, motherhood, and the dangerous shield of tradition. The crowd leaned in instinctively because everyone knew what was coming next wasn't prayer, it was punishment dressed as culture. Uzoamako felt the shift immediately. The air thickened.
The rules changed.
This was no longer about grief. This was about hierarchy, about who had the right to speak and who had the duty to endure. Afok's presence alone rewrote the room, reminding everyone that in some families, tradition isn't heritage, it's a blade sharpened for moments like this. And as Afok adjusted her head tie with calm precision, it became clear she hadn't come to mourn her son. She had come to reclaim control, and tradition was the language she planned to use to do it. A low murmur followed as Afok began invoking customs older than the church itself, rules passed down through whispers, not books, designed to keep widows obedient and quiet. She spoke of how a proper widow should sit, how she should dress, how she should lower her eyes and never appear too confident so soon after burial. Each rule landed like a brick, building a wall around Uzoamako without touching her physically. People nodded, some out of belief, others out of fear of standing out. Uzoamako felt heat rush to her face, not from shame, but from the violence of being erased in real time. Her humanity was being reduced to procedure. Her pain had become an inconvenience tradition needed to discipline. She wanted to scream that grief didn't have a uniform, that love didn't expire with burial rites, but the words stayed trapped to her chest, pressed down by generations of silence. A woman near the aisle clicked her tongue softly, a sound heavy with judgment, and Uzoamako felt it land harder than any insult. Tradition had given the crowd permission to participate. Afok didn't need to raise her voice anymore. The damage was self-sustaining now. She spoke of cleansing rituals, of separation periods, of how a widow must return to her people once the earth closed over her husband. Each sentence subtly repositioned Uzoamako as temporary, as borrowed, as disposable. Uzoamako's fingers curled into her palms again, nails biting skin. She remembered how Ikemba had once laughed bitterly, saying some traditions were created by men afraid of women who might survive without them. Standing there now, she understood exactly what he meant. These customs weren't about respect. They were about control. And Afok was wielding them with terrifying ease. A wave of discomfort rolled through the pews when Afok leaned closer to Uzoamako again, her voice dropping into something almost intimate. She spoke about obedience to elders, about submission as proof of good upbringing, about silence as honor. The words sounded noble, but the intention beneath them was cruel. Uzoamako felt the weight of expectation press down on her spine, bending her forward slightly before she caught herself and straightened. That small act, lifting her shoulders, felt rebellious in a room trained to expect her collapse. The crowd noticed. A few eyebrows rose. A few breaths caught. Afok noticed too. Her eyes narrowed just a fraction, irritation flickering beneath her calm. Tradition was supposed to keep Uzoamako small. And yet, she was still upright. Sweat trickled down Uzoamako's back as the pastor shifted uncomfortably, clearly torn between respect for elders and the unease curling in his gut. He opened his mouth as if to intervene, then closed it again. Tradition had cornered him too. In African spaces, challenging a mother, especially a grieving one, can turn a respected man into a villain overnight. Afok sensed the hesitation and pressed harder, reminding everyone that culture must be upheld, especially in times like this. The irony burned. Times like this, when compassion should lead, were exactly when tradition was being twisted into cruelty. Uzoamako felt something snap quietly inside her, like a thread pulled too far. She wasn't angry yet. She was awakening. The church felt smaller now, walls closing in as Afok finished her ritual of words. She gestured subtly toward the exit, a symbolic dismissal that didn't need explanation. Uzoamako understood the message immediately. You do not belong here anymore. Her chest tightened, breath hitching, but she stayed seated. That decision alone sent a ripple through the room. A few heads turned. A few people exchanged glances. Staying seated was a challenge. Staying seated was resistance. Offok's lips tightened again, the faintest crack in her composure appearing before she smoothed it over. Tradition had expected compliance. What it was getting instead was delay. And delay in power games is dangerous. A deep, steady breath filled Uzuimako's lungs as she locked her hands together, grounding herself in the moment.
She didn't speak.
Not yet. But the silence between her and Offok had changed texture. It wasn't empty anymore.
It was charged.
The crowd felt it too, that subtle wrongness, that sense that something had been pushed too far. Tradition had done its job for generations, but today it had met someone who refused to disappear on schedule. And as Offok straightened, preparing her next move, one truth hovered in the air, heavy and undeniable. When tradition is used as a weapon, it eventually cuts the hand that holds it. But no one yet knew how deep the wound would go. A low rustle moved through the church like wind slipping under a closed door, subtle but unmistakable. It wasn't prayer. It wasn't sympathy. It was gossip finding oxygen. Heads leaned together. Mouths tilted toward ears. Phones vibrated softly as messages were typed with the speed of excitement. Uzuimako felt it before she heard it, the shift from accusation led by one woman to judgment powered by many. Whispers wrapped themselves around her like invisible hands, tightening with every half-formed sentence. Someone said she had been too lucky to marry a Kemba. Someone else muttered that such luck always comes with a price. Each murmur rewrote her story, without her consent. She stared ahead, refusing to look back, knowing that if she turned, she would see curiosity instead of compassion. The grief she carried was heavy, but this was sharper. This was grief sharpened by mouths that had never shared her bed, never held her husband's hand, never knelt beside hospital machines at dawn. And yet, they spoke with certainty, as if pain gave them authority. A woman 2 rows behind clicked her tongue again, louder this time, and sighed as if disappointed. Another shook her head slowly, performing pity for an invisible audience. Uzuimako caught fragments drifting toward her like smoke, words like gold digger, which, bad omen. None were spoken directly to her face. That was the cruelty of it. Gossip thrives in distance. It allows people to wound without accountability. Her chest tightened as she realized the crowd didn't need proof anymore. They had storylines, and those were enough. The same mouths that once praised her humility were now reshaping it into deception. In Lagos, reputation can rise fast, but it can fall even faster, and funerals are fertile ground for destruction. Uzuimako's fingers curled again, this time not from fear, but from disbelief. How quickly grief had turned into entertainment. How easily people chose the loudest voice over the quiet truth. A sudden laugh, short, nervous, inappropriate, escaped from someone near the aisle, quickly swallowed by a cough. That single sound pierced Uzuimako deeper than the insults. It told her something essential had been lost. Respect. The invisible line that separates mourning from mockery had been crossed. She remembered hosting these same people in her home, serving food with a careful smile, listening to their advice, accepting their blessings. Now, they watched her unravel with interest, like spectators waiting for the next scene. The church no longer felt sacred. It felt like a stage, and she was the unwilling performance. She could almost feel the labels sticking to her skin, each whisper another layer she would have to peel off later, if she survived this intact. Offok didn't need to speak anymore. She stood back and let the community finish the work for her. That was her true power, not shouting, but planting doubt and letting it grow wild. Uzuimako saw it clearly now. This wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy. By the time the burial ended, her reputation would already be in pieces, easier to discard, easier to push aside. A woman without credibility has no defense. A widow without support has no ground to stand on. Uzo felt her throat tighten again, but she forced herself to breathe through it, slow and deliberate. Panic would feed the rumors. Tears would confirm them. She realized she was being watched not just to see if she would cry, but to see if she would confirm the version of her they preferred to believe. The air grew warmer as bodies shifted, tension creating heat that no fan could cut through. Uzo's ears rang softly, the sound of blood rushing as her mind raced ahead. She imagined the aftermath, being spoken about in markets, in living rooms, in family WhatsApp groups she didn't even belong to. She imagined her name losing its softness, becoming shorthand for scandal. That future frightened her more than Ofoke's threats. Poverty could be endured. Loneliness could be survived. But public shame in a tightly woven community, that could erase a woman completely. The realization landed hard, forcing a question she had avoided since Ikemba's death. How far would they go if she stayed silent? A breeze slipped through an open window, carrying the smell of dust and distant rain, grounding her for a brief second. She lifted her chin slightly, just enough to meet the space ahead of her, and in that small movement, something shifted again. A few people noticed. The whispers didn't stop, but they changed tone, curiosity replacing certainty. Uzo wasn't behaving like the villain they had already imagined. She wasn't collapsing on cue. She wasn't begging for mercy. That inconsistency unsettled them. Gossip thrives on predictability. Resistance, even quiet resistance, disrupts the narrative. Afoke noticed too. Her eyes narrowed again, sensing control slipping in small, dangerous ways. A hush rippled unexpectedly through one corner of the church as someone stood up briefly, then sat back down, as if reconsidering an action too soon revealed. Uzo felt it like a tremor beneath her feet. Something was shifting beneath the noise. The whispers continued, but they no longer felt like the end of the story, more like a prelude. Shame had been deployed, reputation attacked, silence weaponized. And yet, beneath it all, a different tension was building. Because whispers can only travel so far before they collide with truth. And somewhere in that crowded church, the truth was moving closer, quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to be heard. A sharp tap of wood against marble cut through the whispers, drawing every eye back to the front. Afoke's walking stick, more symbol than support, rested firmly in her grip as she stood taller, straighter, reclaiming the room with practiced ease. Silence followed her movements automatically, the kind of silence earned through years of fear and conditioning. People adjusted their posture when she stood. Some lowered their eyes. Others leaned back, careful not to attract attention. This was not a woman people challenged. This was a woman whose approval could open doors, or seal them shut forever. Uzo felt the weight of that reputation press against her chest. She had seen it before, at family meetings where voices dropped when Afoke entered, where opinions shifted to match hers without argument. Power like that doesn't announce itself. It settles into spaces and waits to be obeyed. Afoke's eyes swept the congregation slowly, deliberately, pausing just long enough on each face to remind them who she was. She didn't need to threaten anyone. Her history did that for her. Stories clung to her like shadows. Of cousins cut off, in-laws pushed aside, neighbors who learned too late that crossing her came with consequences. She had risen from basket weaver to matriarch not through kindness, but through endurance sharpened into dominance. Poverty had hardened her. Wealth had finished the job. Standing there now, she wore grief like armor, motherhood like a crown, and tradition like a law she alone interpreted. Uzo watched her with a clarity that surprised even herself. This wasn't just a grieving mother. This was a woman terrified of losing relevance in a world her son had outgrown. A faint smile tugged at Afoke's lips as she resumed her position near the altar, confident again, steady. She spoke calmly, recounting her sacrifices, her struggles, the years she spent raising Ikemba alone after his father's modest life ended without reward. The crowd murmured approval. Mothers nodded. Elders sighed in sympathy. Afoke let them linger there, soaking in their empathy, before twisting the story just enough to redirect it. She spoke of how sons forget their roots once money enters the picture, how wives sometimes encourage that forgetting. The implication was clear. Uzuamako felt eyes return to her like heat-seeking missiles. The blame had found its target again, and Afolk, satisfied, let the silence stretch, letting the accusations sink without ever fully naming it. Uzuamako's heartbeat thudded in her ears as memories flooded back. Afolk's subtle digs at her education, her background, her family. The way every achievement was downplayed, every mistake magnified. She remembered the quiet warnings Ikemba had given her, always careful, always protective, telling her to be patient, telling her he would handle his mother in time. Time, it turned out, had not been on his side. Now, without him, Afolk's restraint had vanished. The control she once masked behind politeness was out in the open, unapologetic. Uzuamako felt the injustice of it all settle deep in her bones. Years of endurance had earned her nothing but a public execution of character. A man near the front cleared his throat as if to speak, then thought better of it. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the imbalance, but unwilling to correct it. Fear is contagious, and Afolk had spread it well. Uzuamako realized then that this wasn't just personal. This was structural. A system that protected women like Afolk while consuming women like her. The realization burned, not with rage, but with clarity. Afolk wasn't powerful because she was right. She was powerful because no one had ever stopped her. And now, the cost of that silence was being paid in Uzuamako's dignity. Sweat gathered at the base of Uzuamako's neck as Afolk shifted again, preparing to press further, sensing victory close at hand. The room felt tilted in her favor, the crowd already aligned. Uzuamako felt small, but not weak. Small like a seed under soil, compressed, waiting. She straightened her back slightly, a movement almost imperceptible, but enough to draw a brief pause in Afolk's rhythm. Power notices resistance, even when it's quiet. Afolk's eyes flicked toward her again, sharp, assessing, calculating. Something had changed, and she could feel it. A heavy stillness settled as Afolk lifted her chin, ready to deliver what she believed would be the final blow. The congregation waited, breath held, already convinced they knew how this would end. The feared mother-in-law would speak. The widow would shrink. Order would be restored. But beneath that expectation, something fragile was cracking. Because fear, when pushed too far, stops paralyzing and starts provoking. And as Afolk opened her mouth again, confident in her authority, she failed to notice that the woman she had spent years suppressing was no longer bowed. She was watching, and she was remembering everything. A dull ache settled behind Uzuamako's eyes as the church noise faded into something distant, replaced by memories that felt sharper than the present. She stared past the altar, past the flowers, past the casket, and found herself back at the beginning. Before wealth, before fear, before Afolk's shadow stretched across her life. She remembered Lagos evenings heavy with traffic and impatience, the smell of rain on hot asphalt, the night a stranger's car stalled in floodwater, and destiny decided to interfere. Ikemba had stood there frustrated, shoes already ruined, phone dead, security nowhere to be found. And she, unknown, unimportant by society's standards, had walked up calmly, offered directions, help, reassurance, without once asking who he was. That was the miracle he later spoke about. Not love at first sight. Recognition. Someone who treated him like a man, not a wallet. The crowd would never know that part. They only saw the billionaire. They never saw the man who felt safe enough to fall. A soft tightening gripped her chest as she remembered the early days of their marriage, hidden from public noise.
No cameras. No flashy ceremonies.
Just quiet mornings, shared meals, laughter echoing through a house that felt like a refuge. Ikemba loved her openly, stubbornly, in a way that irritated his world. He listened to her. He defended her. He changed routines, priorities, even business schedules because he wanted to be present. Those changes were later weaponized against her, but in truth, they were proof of something rare: partnership. The crowd didn't know about the nights he came home exhausted and still asked about her day, or how he trusted her instincts on deals, or how he laughed when she teased him for working too hard. They didn't know love had lived there. And love, when erased, leaves space for lies. A faint ringing filled her ears as she recalled the first time Afok openly disapproved, the tension crackling across a family dinner table thick with forced smiles. Ikemba had squeezed Uzoamako's hand under the table, a silent promise of protection. He had always stood between her and his mother's cruelty, absorbing the blows, redirecting the anger, buying time. The crowd never saw those moments. They never saw how much he shielded her. And now, with him gone, that shield had disappeared, exposing truths that were never meant for public consumption. The irony stung. His absence had made her vulnerable, but it had also made the lies louder than ever. Her throat tightened as she remembered the sickness. How sudden it was, how unfair. The hospital lights. The endless waiting. The way Afok had suddenly appeared more often, watching closely, asking questions that didn't sound like concern. Uzoamako remembered sleeping in a chair, refusing to leave Ikemba's side, while others came and went. She remembered how his hand squeezed hers weakly, how his eyes searched her face even when he could barely speak. Those were vows no ceremony ever captured. The crowd didn't know who stayed. They didn't know who prayed until words ran out. And now, those same people felt qualified to judge a marriage they had never truly seen. A wave of bitterness rose, not toward Ikemba, but toward the cruelty of public ignorance. Outsiders always imagine they know the truth because they saw the surface. They see money. They see power. They assume transactions instead of devotion. Uzoamako felt the injustice burn slowly, steadily, fueling something new inside her. She wasn't just defending herself anymore. She was defending the integrity of a love story being rewritten by people who had never earned the right. The realization gave her spine strength. Love, she knew now, doesn't need witnesses to be real, but it deserves witnesses when it's being buried alive. A subtle shift ran through her body as she lifted her head a little higher, eyes no longer clouded only by grief. The crowd still didn't know. They still couldn't imagine the man Ikemba had been behind closed doors. They didn't know about the conversations, the planning, the warnings he had given, the careful steps he had taken toward something he sensed might come. Those details remained hidden for now, tucked away like embers waiting for oxygen. Uzoamako felt it clearly. This humiliation wasn't random. It was incomplete. There were pieces missing, and their absence was deliberate. A slow breath escaped her lips as she realized the truth carried its own timing. The crowd believed they were watching the end of a story, a widow disgraced, a mother victorious. But they were wrong. What they didn't know about the marriage was exactly what would undo everything they assumed. Ikemba had loved her enough to prepare for betrayal. He had trusted her enough to leave something behind. And as Uzoamako's gaze drifted back to the casket, one certainty settled deep within her. The marriage they were mocking was not finished speaking yet. It was only waiting for the right moment to be heard. A low hum from the church generator blended with the distant sound of traffic as Uzoamako's thoughts drifted to the weeks before everything collapsed. Ikemba had been quieter then. Not weak, not afraid, but observant in a way that unsettled her. He watched people longer. He asked questions he used to brush off. His laughter still came, but it ended faster, like a door closing before it should. One night in their Lagos home, while the city pulsed outside the windows, he stood by the balcony longer than usual, phone glowing softly in his hand. He didn't explain what he was reading. He only said the world changes quickly when money and blood mix. Uzoamako hadn't understood then. She thought it was business. She didn't know he was already preparing for a future where his voice would be missing, and someone else would try to speak over him. A memory tightened around her chest as she recalled how he had started insisting on order, documents sorted, files copied, instructions written down instead of spoken. Ikemba had always moved fast, trusting instinct and speed, but now he slowed himself on purpose. He called lawyers quietly. Not the flashy ones who chased headlines, but the patient ones who understood discretion. Uzo noticed, but she didn't question him. Trust had always flowed easily between them. She never imagined those careful movements were acts of protection. Looking back now, she saw them clearly. He wasn't afraid of death. He was afraid of injustice. Afraid that silence would be mistaken for consent. Afraid that love, once he was gone, would be crushed under tradition and greed. The smell of polish and flowers in the church pulled her deeper into memory, to the hospital days when Ikemba's breathing became labored and time felt slippery. Even then, he was alert in ways that frightened her. He noticed Afok's sudden interest, the way questions circled money more than health, legacy more than comfort. He squeezed Uzoamako's hand one afternoon, eyes sharp despite the machines, and said something that had confused her then but haunted her now. That people reveal their truest selves when they think they are about to inherit something. She had smiled weakly, trying to keep hope alive. She didn't realize he was documenting those revelations silently, turning concern into preparation. A slow ache spread through her as she remembered the last private conversation they shared without witnesses. The hospital room was quiet, lights dimmed, the city breathing outside. Ikemba had asked her if she trusted him completely. The question startled her, not because of doubt, but because of its urgency. She answered without hesitation. He nodded, satisfied, then told her that sometimes love must be protected from family, not enemies. He didn't elaborate. He didn't dramatize. He simply held her hand a little tighter, like he was transferring responsibility without ceremony. At the time, she thought it was fear talking. Now, standing in that church, she understood it had been foresight. A subtle chill moved through her body as she remembered the envelope he had given her days before his condition worsened. Plain. Unmarked. He told her not to open it unless she had to. He said the words lightly, like a joke, but his eyes were serious, steady, unyielding. She had tucked it away, uncomfortable with the implication, unwilling to imagine a world without him. The crowd at the funeral didn't know that moment existed. They didn't know Ikemba had already spoken into the future. They didn't know his silence now was intentional, strategic. Death hadn't ended his agency. It had merely delayed its effect. A faint tremor ran through Uzoamako as she realized how carefully everything had been arranged. Ikemba hadn't trusted power to goodwill. He trusted it to structure.
To ink.
To witnesses who wouldn't be swayed by tears or tradition. The promise he left behind wasn't romantic. It was deliberate. It was protection disguised as paperwork. And as humiliating words continued to float through the church, Uzoamako understood something that steadied her breathing. This moment had been anticipated. The cruelty unfolding now was not a surprise to the man she married. It was the reason he had acted. A quiet resolve settled into her bones as she lifted her eyes once more toward the front of the church. Ikemba was gone, yes, but he had not left her defenseless. The promise he left behind was waiting, patient, restrained by timing rather than doubt. The crowd believed they were witnessing the final erasure of a widow. Afok believed she had won. But beneath the surface of that funeral, beneath the whispers and judgment, a decision made long ago was inching closer to daylight. And when it surfaced, it wouldn't speak softly. It would speak with authority that no tradition could silence. A long, uneven breath slipped out of Uzoamako's chest as if her body had been holding it for hours without her permission. The church felt heavier now, thick with judgment and heat, but something inside her shifted, loosening just enough to let clarity in. She straightened slowly, vertebra by vertebra, the movement subtle yet deliberate, like someone waking from a long, forced sleep. Her hands stopped shaking. The noise around her dulled. For the first time since Ikemba's name was spoken over the casket, she wasn't shrinking. She wasn't bracing for impact. She was arriving. Heads turned, not because she spoke, but because silence can change temperature when it no longer belongs to fear. The widow everyone expected to fold was still seated, still breathing steadily, and that alone unsettled the room. Light from the stained glass windows caught her face as she lifted her chin, revealing eyes no longer clouded only by grief. They were focused now, present, watching. She took in all folks' posture, the crowd's hunger, the pastor's hesitation, the phones still poised like weapons. She saw the pattern clearly at last, the choreography of humiliation, the timing, the expectation of collapse. And in seeing it, she stepped outside it. Her grief didn't disappear, but it rearranged itself, making space for something firmer. Resolve doesn't arrive loudly. It settles. It grounds. And as Uzoamako's shoulders squared, a quiet discomfort rippled through those watching, because victims are expected to look broken, not alert. A faint memory brushed against her mind. Ikemba's voice, calm and steady, telling her never to rush truth, never to waste it when timing matters. The thought anchored her like a hand on her back. She didn't need to defend herself yet. She didn't need to plead. She needed to stand fully in her own body, to reclaim presence before reclaiming narrative. The realization slowed her breathing, deepened it. The crowd mistook her calm for surrender. Afolk mistook it for exhaustion. Both were wrong. Calm, Uzoamako understood now, was the most dangerous thing she could offer in a room designed to break her. A subtle murmur passed through the pews as people noticed the change. It wasn't dramatic. No tears wiped away, no sudden outburst. But the energy had shifted. Uzoamako's stillness had weight now. It demanded attention without asking for it. Even Afolk paused longer than usual before speaking again, irritation flickering across her face like a crack in porcelain. Power recognizes resistance instinctively, even when it can't yet name it. Uzoamako felt that recognition land between them, electric and tense. She met it without flinching. Her fingers relaxed at last, palms open against her lap, as if releasing something she had carried for too long. She felt the urge to speak rise and fall, and she let it pass. Not yet. Timing mattered. She had endured the storm. Now she was watching its structure, memorizing its weak points. The humiliation no longer felt endless. It felt staged, and stages, she knew, could be dismantled. The crowd leaned forward again, confused, unsure whether to anticipate tears or defiance. That uncertainty gave her quiet control. A bead of sweat traced down her temple, but her posture remained firm. She noticed how Afolk's voice grew sharper, how her words came faster now, less polished. The mother-in-law was pressing because she sensed delay, sensed loss of momentum. Uzoamako didn't respond. She let the imbalance widen. In every power struggle, there comes a moment when the aggressor reveals desperation. Uzoamako felt it approaching, steady and inevitable, like a tide turning without drama. A slow, deliberate inhale filled her lungs as she finally raised her eyes fully toward the front of the church, gaze steady, unblinking. She didn't challenge Afolk yet. She didn't address the crowd. But the moment marked a turning point all the same. The widow who had been expected to disappear had fully arrived, rooted in purpose, guided by patience. And as the church settled into an uneasy quiet, one truth hung heavy in the air. Whatever came next would not be an emotional outburst. It would be calculated. And it would cost someone far more than they were prepared to lose. A faint scrape of shoes against the tiled floor broke the uneasy stillness, subtle but sharp enough to pull attention from every corner of the church. A man rose slowly from the middle pews, movements careful, deliberate, like someone stepping onto thin ice. He wasn't dressed like family, nor like clergy, just neat, professional, unremarkable. In his hand was a slim brown envelope, edges crisp, untouched by the chaos unfolding around it. The sight of it felt wrong in a place filled with flowers and grief. Objects like that carried weight, purpose. Uzoamako felt her breath catch, not in surprise, but recognition. Her fingers tingled. Somewhere deep inside, memory stirred. The crowd shifted again, curious now, attention snapping away from Afolk as the man moved forward, stopping just short of the altar. In Lagos, envelopes don't interrupt funerals unless something serious is about to happen. And suddenly, the air felt electric, charged with anticipation no one could name yet. The man didn't speak immediately. He waited, letting the silence stretch until it grew uncomfortable, until every whisper died on its own. Offok's head turned sharply, irritation flashing across her face as control slipped from her grasp for the first time that day. This wasn't part of her plan. This interruption hadn't been rehearsed. The man held the envelope higher now, not dramatically, just clearly, making sure it was seen. People leaned forward instinctively.
Phone steadied.
The pastor frowned, uncertain whether to allow what was happening, but hesitation froze him in place. Uzuimako's heart thudded hard against her ribs, not with fear, but with alignment. Timing. Ikemba's voice echoed faintly in her mind again. Let it come when they least expect it. A soft murmur rippled through the congregation as the man finally stepped closer, careful not to touch the casket, as if respecting a boundary even the dead deserved. The envelope looked ordinary, no seals, no stamps, but its presence felt heavy, almost loud. Offok straightened, lifting her chin defensively, already preparing arguments, already sensing threat. She spoke sharply, questioning the interruption, asserting authority, reminding everyone of tradition and respect. But tradition has limits, and authority falters when paperwork enters the room. The man didn't flinch. He simply placed the envelope on the pulpit, flat and undeniable, and stepped back half a pace. That single movement shifted power more effectively than shouting ever could. Uzuimako felt the room tilt. The whispers changed tone, curiosity overtaking certainty. The crowd didn't know what the envelope contained, but they understood instinctively that it mattered. Offok's confidence wavered, just enough to be visible. Her eyes darted briefly toward the envelope, then away, as if refusing to acknowledge it might carry something she couldn't control. The pastor cleared his throat, tension evident in the stiffness of his shoulders, and reached for the envelope with hesitant fingers. In that moment, grief paused. Judgment paused. The story everyone thought they knew hovered, fragile, waiting to be rewritten. A soft rustle filled the church as the envelope was opened. No dramatic sound.
No flourish.
Just paper sliding free. The pastor's eyes scanned the contents, once, then again, slower this time. His expression changed, not shock, not confusion, but recognition. Understanding. The kind that settles heavy and final. A hush fell so deep it felt unnatural, like the city outside had stopped breathing too. Uzuimako felt warmth spread through her chest, steadying her. She didn't need to look. She already knew what was written there. Ikemba had spoken. A ripple of gasps followed as the pastor began to read silently, lips pressing together, brow furrowing. Offok stepped forward sharply, demanding explanation, but her voice sounded thinner now, less commanding. The words on the page weren't emotional. They were precise, legal, unarguable.
A will.
Final instructions. Conditions laid out clearly, intentionally, without room for interpretation.
Property. Authority.
Guardianship. Safeguards. Everything Offok had tried to seize through shame was already accounted for. In ink. Uzuimako felt her knees weaken slightly, not from fear, but from release. The trap had failed. As the pastor lifted his eyes from the document, the church seemed to hold its breath again, suspended between what had been assumed and what was about to be confirmed. Offok stood frozen, her carefully built narrative cracking under the weight of something she couldn't shout down. The envelope lay open on the pulpit, its contents no longer hidden, its timing perfect. And as the pastor prepared to speak aloud, one truth settled over the room with undeniable force. The funeral was no longer about the dead.
It was about accountability.
And whatever came next would change the balance of power forever. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the church as the pastor finally raised his head, eyes no longer scanning paper but faces. The silence felt brittle now, stretched thin by expectation. When he began to speak, his voice carried weight, not volume, but certainty. Each sentence landed clean and final, cutting through hours of accusation with the precision of fact. The will was clear. Ikemba's intentions unmistakable. Authority over his estate, his properties, his legacy had already been decided, and not in the direction the crowd had been coached to expect. Heads turned slowly, almost mechanically, away from Uzuamako and toward Afolk, as if pulled by an invisible string. The shift was subtle, but irreversible. Judgment had found a new address. Afolk's face tightened as the words continued, lines deepening around her mouth, her posture stiffening like something bracing for impact. The woman who had commanded the room minutes earlier now stood exposed under the same gaze she once directed outward. Her eyes flicked from face to face, searching for allies, for affirmation, for the familiar comfort of fear, but what she found instead was hesitation.
Distance. Doubt.
The crowd no longer leaned toward her. They leaned away. Phones that once captured Uzuamako's humiliation now angled discreetly in Afolk's direction. Shame, it turned out, moved faster than loyalty. A murmur rose again, different from before, uncertain, conflicted, edged with regret. People replayed Afolk's earlier words in their minds, measuring them against what they now knew. The accusations felt heavier now, uglier, stripped of their assumed righteousness. Uzuamako felt it without moving, the pressure lifting from her shoulders, the invisible hands loosening their grip. She didn't smile. She didn't react. She simply remained still, letting truth do what emotion never could. The restraint unsettled people more than anger would have. It forced them to sit with their own participation. Afolk attempted to speak, her mouth opening with familiar urgency, but the sound that came out lacked its former authority. The room no longer bent to her tone. A few elders shifted uncomfortably. Someone cleared their throat. Another looked down at their hands. The power dynamic had cracked, and through that crack poured everything she had tried to bury: greed, control, resentment. Her words stumbled over themselves now. Explanations tangled, justifications rushed. It was the sound of someone losing command of a story they thought they owned. Uzuamako finally stood, not abruptly, not defiantly, but with a calm that commanded attention without asking for it. The movement alone silenced the remaining murmurs. She didn't address Afolk. She didn't address the crowd. She stood because she could, because she no longer needed permission. That quiet act reframed the entire scene. The widow they had tried to erase was standing in dignity, while the woman who came to dominate now struggled to hold ground. Shame, having changed sides, had nowhere left to hide. A wave of discomfort spread as people avoided Afolk's eyes, unwilling to meet the consequences of what they had enabled. Sympathy shifted, subtle but undeniable. The narrative had collapsed, and with it, the safety of mob judgment. Uzuamako felt the room recalibrate around her, respect seeping back in not as applause, but as silence, the kind reserved for truth that doesn't need decoration. She didn't savor it. She simply occupied it. As the pastor folded the document carefully and stepped back, the church settled into a stunned quiet that felt nothing like mourning. It felt like reckoning. Afolk stood rigid, caught between outrage and realization, while Uzuamako remained steady, untouched by the chaos that had once threatened to consume her. Shame had crossed the room completely now, attaching itself to the one who had wielded it so freely. And as the congregation sat with the weight of that reversal, one thing became painfully clear. This story was no longer about humiliation. It was about consequences, and they had only just begun. A strange calm settled over the church, the kind that follows a storm when everyone is too stunned to speak. The air felt cooler somehow, as if justice itself had opened a window. Afolk stood frozen near the altar, her hands clenched so tightly the veins on them stood out, her authority evaporating in real time. No thunder followed.
No dramatic collapse.
Karma arrived quietly, the way it often does, through stillness, through silence, through the sudden refusal of a room to obey you anymore. Uzuamako felt it immediately. The danger had passed, but the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The shift wasn't loud, but it was final. Eyes that once followed Afolk with fear now avoided her entirely. Respect, she realized too late, is not permanent, it's rented. And the rent had just expired. A few elders exchanged looks that carried more judgment than any insult. Someone who had nodded along earlier now frowned, uncomfortable with their own memory. Karma worked its way through the room like ink in water, spreading slowly, staining everything it touched. Offok tried to adjust a wrapper again, a nervous habit now, but even that familiar gesture no longer commanded attention. Power had left her body before she fully understood it. A soft scoff escaped from somewhere in the back, not loud, not cruel, but enough to slice through Offok's composure. That sound would have been unthinkable an hour earlier. Now it was inevitable. She turned sharply, searching for the source, but found only lowered gazes and stiff expressions. Fear had abandoned her. And without fear, her cruelty had nowhere to stand. Uzuamako watched quietly, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This wasn't revenge. It was balance. The kind that arrives when someone pushes too far for too long. Offok attempted to regain footing, straightening her shoulders, lifting her chin, summoning the voice that once bent rooms to her will. But it came out brittle, thin, stripped of the authority it once carried. Each word sounded like justification instead of command, excuse instead of truth. The crowd didn't interrupt her. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than opposition. It said everything. The woman who ruled through intimidation now stood exposed to the very judgment she had unleashed. Karma didn't need to humiliate her. It only needed to remove her shield. Uzuamako felt a quiet release move through her chest. Not joy, not triumph, but relief. The burden she had carried, of proving herself, of surviving lies, lifted gently, like hands letting go. She remained composed, refusing the temptation to react, understanding that dignity was now her strongest statement. The room watched her more closely now, measuring her not by rumor, but by presence. And what they saw unsettled them. Strength without cruelty. Victory without noise. Karma, it seemed, favored restraint. A distant roll of thunder echoed faintly outside, barely audible, almost coincidental. But it made several people glance toward the doors, as if expecting the sky itself to comment. Nothing followed.
No rain. No spectacle.
Just quiet accountability settling into place. Offok sank slowly into a chair, the movement heavy, reluctant, as though gravity itself had increased. The feared matriarch looked suddenly small. Not because Uzuamako had risen, but because her own actions had finally caught up with her. As the service moved awkwardly toward its end, the lesson hung thick in the air. Karma doesn't shout. It doesn't warn. It doesn't rush. It waits until cruelty exposes itself, then steps aside and lets truth do the work. Offok had arrived at the funeral certain she would leave victorious. Instead, she remained seated, stripped of control, surrounded by the silence of people who no longer feared her. And Uzuamako, standing steady amid it all, understood something profound. Justice hadn't needed her anger. It had only needed her to endure long enough for the truth to arrive. The service ended without ceremony, as if the room itself was eager to release what it had just witnessed. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. People stood, hesitated, then began to move in uncertain patterns, unsure which conversations were still safe to have. The casket remained where it was, quiet and final, but the energy around it had changed completely. Grief was still present, yes, but it was no longer the only thing in the air. Accountability lingered. Uzuamako stood calmly, black veil resting against her shoulders, feeling the strange weight of freedom mixed with loss. Nothing about this moment felt victorious. It felt consequential. Ikemba was still gone. That truth didn't soften. But something else had been salvaged. Her name, her dignity, her right to exist without apology. Light spilled through the church doors as they opened, carrying in the noise of Lagos again, horns, footsteps, life continuing without pause. People passed Uzuamako more carefully now, nodding, murmuring quiet greetings they had withheld earlier. Some couldn't meet her eyes. Others tried and failed. Sympathy came late, awkward, but she accepted none of it personally. What mattered had already been settled. Afolk remained seated near the front, shoulders heavy, gaze unfocused, surrounded by the silence of her own making. No one rushed to console her. Power, once stripped, rarely attracts comfort. Uzuamako stepped outside, the heat hitting her skin like a reminder that she was still alive, still standing in a world that hadn't ended with her husband's last breath. She inhaled deeply, the scent of dust and rain filling her lungs, grounding her in the present. Ikemba's absence felt sharp, but it no longer felt like an open wound bleeding into her future. He had loved her well. He had protected her even in death. That knowledge settled into her like armor, quiet, unflashy, unbreakable. A few steps away, she paused, allowing herself a brief moment of stillness. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply stood there, letting the truth of everything wash over her. Grief doesn't vanish when justice arrives. It changes shape. It becomes something you carry instead of something that carries you. Uzuamako felt that shift clearly now. She wasn't healed, but she was anchored. And that made all the difference. Behind her, voices resumed cautiously, already reshaping the story in softer tones. Rumors faded, replaced by reflection. Some would forget the lesson. Others would remember. But Uzuamako didn't need the crowd to learn anything. Her journey forward didn't depend on their growth. It depended on her resolve. And that had already been forged in fire. She adjusted her veil one last time and began to walk, each step steady, deliberate, unhurried. The city stretched ahead of her, vast and indifferent, full of possibilities that didn't require permission from tradition or fear. She wasn't walking away from her marriage. She was carrying it forward, with integrity intact, with truth preserved, with love honored the only way that mattered. As she disappeared into the flow of Lagos life, one question lingered, not just for those who witnessed the scene, but for anyone listening now. When tradition is used to wound, when silence is demanded in the face of injustice, what would you do? Would you bow and disappear, or would you endure long enough for truth to speak? Because in the end, grief may break you, but dignity, once reclaimed, changes everything. If you were the one that was humiliated in this video, and God being so kind later saved you from the hands of your enemies, what will be your reaction towards your oppressors? Comment and subscribe on this channel. Let us know your mind.